Armed with a workshop full of tools, guided by detailed research, these restoration crews are bringing a legend back to life. This is the German-built Panzerkampfwagen V, the Panther. One of the most feared tanks of the Second World War. Lethal, accurate, almost unstoppable. One-on-one, nothing the Allies had could take it down. Even today, the Panther's influence lives on. And now, the original tanks are so rare, they're being hunted all over the world to be rescued from oblivion. Some people collect stamps. Some people collect coins. Then there are collectors who work on a massive scale. You want to collect tanks? You'll need a stack of cash. You've got to handle a blowtorch like a scalpel. And you've got to know your history down to every last nut and bolt. This is Jacques Littlefield. He's assembled one of the largest private tank collections in the world, and it's on display in Portola Valley, California.
The collection at this point has approximately 220 vehicles. Most of them are combat vehicles as opposed to soft-skin vehicles, and about 65 are actual battle tanks.
This is Kevin Wheatcroft. Stationed in Arnsby, England, Kevin has more than 230 military vehicles.
Last year, it hit me and I realized that between 2 and 4 years for a restoration, I'm not going to live long enough to restore everything that I own. That's impossible.
Both Kevin and Jacques are extremely wealthy. They have to be. A single restoration can cost millions. You need a fully loaded workshop and a team of experts who can create new parts, find old ones, and know how to put it all back together. For serious collectors, there's always a holy grail. Built in Germany, baptized in battle in 1943. A tank so deadly, so feared, Russian crews would capture them and use them as their own. The formidable Panzerkampfwagen V Panther.
The Panther is a particularly interesting tank. Historically, it's considered by many people to be the best tank design of World War II.
To me, the Panther is probably the most special of all the German tanks. It looked right, it sounded right, and most times it worked right.
The Panther terrified the Allies for good reason. Its 75mm gun was deadly accurate from over 3,000 yards away. Its armor was so tough, Allied guns couldn't penetrate it. Facing off against an Allied tank, the kill ratio was all in the Panther's favor.
Once the Panther was sorted technically for battle, it was virtually unstoppable in its time and worked on a ratio of about 5 Shermans or 9 T-34s as a kill ratio to knock one out. So that gives you an idea of how impressive the Panther really was.
Today, a functioning Panther tank is one of the rarest machines in the world. Both Jacques and Kevin have spent years slowly bringing their Panthers back to life.
The Panther Owners Club is a very, very unique club. There's only 4 or 5 of us in the world.
I found out the hard way, once you start, it's a very, very expensive road. And once you're part way down it, there's really no turning back.
I think we always kind of look at each other and wonder, are we both out of our minds or what?
If you want to assemble a tank, first you need to assemble the right crew. Jacques has brought together some of the best in the world. Greg Taylor is the Panther's project manager.
Well, I've had an interest in military vehicles since I was a kid. In fact, I had a World War II Dodge weapons carrier that I drove to high school.
Dave Marion started here when he was still in high school. He's a wizard with a blowtorch or a laptop.
One of my responsibilities is to help figure out how to rebuild or replace or create the pieces that were missing or damaged on the vehicle. So I will take the original pieces that are damaged and measure them and dimension them and figure out how to rebuild them.
Keith Bowles can fix just about anything, with or without the manual.
We have approximately 400 years worth of work here, so I hope I stay long enough to make it.
During the Second World War, Germany only produced about 6,000 Panthers. Tiny numbers compared to the 50,000 Sherman tanks cranked out by the US. After the war, most Panthers became scrap metal. So even finding a Panther today is next to impossible. Jacques' Panther quest began thousands of miles from his home and stretches back to a tough, grim war. Poland, January 1945. German and Soviet forces were locked in a death struggle. Knocked out in battle, a 45-ton Panther sinks to the bottom of the Black Nita River. The sunken treasure remains there for over 40 years, waiting for a second chance. And this Panther is lucky enough to get it.
I bought it from a German collector, and he'd had it for about 10 years. He'd purchased it from a fellow in Poland who'd actually pulled it out of the river. The hull was reasonably intact, although destroyed in a number of places, but the turret had been completely blown apart.
When the Panther was first delivered, it was about the sorriest condition of any vehicle we'd ever had delivered here.
I thought it was unrestorable, and if we did restore it, it'd take at least 10 years.
Everything that you looked at was either cracked, rusted really heavily, all the hydraulic tubing was bent and rusted and damaged.
It was almost like a dream. You know, we're really going to do this because it's going to commit the shop to many years of work. When I went over to Jacques to get some sort of reassurance from him, he said, well, basically, this is probably the most challenging project we'll ever have.
To rebuild the Panther, the crew live and breathe a whole range of disciplines.
It's working with metal, it's working with wood, it's working with electricity, it's working with hydraulics. And then on top of that, to try to do it historically, so you're researching the paints and the materials like that, that adds a certain amount of complexity to it as well.
When you're rebuilding a 45-ton tank, you're going to need some heavy-duty help.
You'll notice in the shop we have a 15-ton overhead crane, and we have hydraulic cylinders that go up to 50, 60, and 100 tons to pull things apart.
So a lot of time and effort goes into figuring out how to remove the piece, how to restore the piece without damaging the piece of equipment or us. I have stitches here from a grinder and stitches here from a piece of sheet metal. So I guess it adds character.
The team is not only putting together a tank. As they scrape off the paint, untangle the electrical systems, and open up sealed compartments, they're also unraveling a mystery. How did this tank end up at the bottom of the Black Nita River? Was it hit by another tank? Or by a Soviet rocket? Did the engine die in the heat of battle? Did Sabotage take down the mighty machine? Jacques' team will have to salvage every possible clue to uncover the mysterious death of their Panther. Born and built in Germany, shattered in Poland during World War II, transported to what was once enemy territory. This Panther tank is getting an extreme makeover. This is the world's largest private collection of military vehicles. Jacques Littlefield's team have set themselves a huge challenge. A burnt-out, rusted Panther tank is going to be restored with military precision.
We try and keep the same welding process that was used originally. If they used arc welding originally, we put the pieces back together with arc welding. And we use the same type of rods, the same process, and we try and make everything look the same. Try to replicate the width of the welds and the shape of the bead and make it look exactly the same.
In preparation for surgery, the tank is stripped down and examined from top to bottom.
We take the major pieces off, usually the turret, the tracks, the engine, and we evaluate what can be reused, what has to be completely replaced, and then of course what we're missing.
When we're cleaning out the vehicle, on this vehicle, we found the slide for a World War II German handgun. We found unused machine gun rounds that would have been used for the bow gun or the coax gun that's in the turret. We found a flare gun cartridge.
Long after this Panther's final action, Dave found himself under fire.
We had vacuumed out the interior of the vehicle fairly extensively, and I was using a large rosebud torch to heat a suspension component up in the front corner. And I put the torch down in this area where there was still a machine gun round, and the thing went off, and my ears were ringing, and I thought I'd been shot. I checked for puncture wounds, and it was pretty scary because I didn't know it was there, but obviously I found it with the torch.
Yeah, I hear this bang, and it was really loud, and I yelled over, "Are you all right, Dave?" And he didn't say anything at first, and then, "Yeah, I'm okay,"
Everybody in the shop heard it, rushed to the scene. "Are you okay?"
The Panther was known for its in-your-face design features. The Panther's front armor was angled, and this gave it a deadly edge in combat.
The chief advantage of sloped armor is the fact that if you take, say like on the front of the Panther, the glacis they call it, the upper piece of plate, is a little bit thicker than 3 inches. And when you take a 3-inch plate and lay it down, that plate essentially becomes thicker. There's a longer distance that a projectile would have to travel through it. And you also have a deflection factor, where a projectile that may hit that angled plate may just deflect right over the vehicle.
The Panther's sloped armor was copied directly from the enemy, from the Russian T-34.
Prior to the invasion of Russia in June of 1941, German tank design tended to be, as many other countries did, basically with vertical sides, basically a block design. And once the Germans saw the Russian tank, they realized instantly that this was a superior design. And I think it was a real shock to them.
This Panther isn't giving the restoration crew any breaks. After one world war and decades immersed in a river, the turret is too far gone to be saved. But the damage yields tantalizing clues about the Panther's final moments.
When the tank arrived, of course, the turret was separate. And it was obviously fractured and blown apart by an explosion. That was the first apparent thing that we found.
The entire top plate, armor plate, was warped real heavily, we think, from the explosion. And then we had a piece of armor on the left side that is about 5/8 thick that was completely shattered.
So the Panther took a savage hit, strong enough to shatter heavy armor plate and push back the tank's firewall with the engine attached. Where did that explosion come from? Another tank? A mine? A rocket at close range? As the crew rebuilds their Panther, it's possible all the answers they're seeking could remain submerged forever beneath the surface of the Black Needle River. Under the California sun and in the English countryside, two tank crews are bringing German Panthers back to life. Brian and Alan Rudder work at the Kevin Wheatcroft Collection, one of the biggest in the world. In a tank workshop, sometimes just unscrewing a rusted nut and bolt can turn into a major headache.
You should be able to rotate this to get to the anchor bolts at the back that hold the whole assembly, the backing plate on, and you can't get to them because it's corroded solid.
Panther tank's been in the workshop now for something like 4 years, although we've worked on it for about 2.5. It took a year just to take it apart. This thing had stood for 50 years in a French scrapyard. It's one of those things I've wanted. As a child, I saw the pictures in the comics and in the war films, and I wanted one.
No, it's still got the size, hasn't it?
Once we get all that undone and the inner drum off, we have to pull it out that way, out of the hull, hang it on there. It's quite a heavy thing. The end plug's gone, which is a shame, but the other plugs are still in, so there's a good chance of it being reasonable condition.
Heating up the metal can help loosen parts that have been locked in place for decades. If that fails, there's always the last resort. Cut the piece off.
We don't like cutting stuff, it's the last resort. You persevere for so long and then in the end it's just not feasible. You have to give up, admit defeat.
I'll get the forklift and move it straight out. We're doing a hand rolling it out.
Like that. That there is attached to the mechanism here. There's a circuit that goes on there. You're supposed to take the circuit off through one of those windows, and when you pull this whole assembly off, that's supposed to slide off of here, but that's just corroded solid. I was warming it, frying it, but so in the end, last resort.
It's been a lot of heartache, but great fun. It's a mixture of sort of archaeology, mechanics, and just the joy of seeing something come back to life again.
In combat, the Panther was feared for many reasons. Ferociously accurate, the Panther's gun is considered by many to be the best of the Second World War. This gun fired 75mm rounds and could take out enemy tanks at 3,000 yards. If an American Sherman ever came face to face with the Panther, it was no contest.
At the shop here, we have a lot of tours come through, and we have tankers that were in World War II that come up and tell some of the horror stories about being in a Sherman tank, getting shot at. Some of them come up and just look at the Panther now, and they just tremble looking at that gun because they're still scared of it.
The Panther's barrel was more than twice as long as the Sherman's, and this gave it a much higher muzzle velocity.
That was the primary advantage the gun had. It had a velocity in excess of 3,000 feet per second, depending on the kind of ammunition using. At the time, the Sherman tank was on the order of 2,000 feet per second. The velocity, which will determine both your accuracy and how much armor you can go through, how much energy you can deliver to the target.
The Sherman tank had a similar sized gun, but a lower velocity weapon. And the Sherman didn't have the ability to penetrate any part of the Panther, but the Panther gun had the ability to penetrate basically any section of the Sherman because of the higher velocity of the main gun. It was a one shot, one kill kind of an affair, you know, a Panther versus a Sherman.
One of the toughest challenges for the crew is the Panther's turret. It's one of the most complex pieces on the most complex tank of its day.
This turret is so badly shattered, and it has had so many shoddy repair attempts that we determined that it would just be better to start over with new material. Somebody's attempted to weld these cracks up with the wrong welding rod, which you can see it then cracked again. If it was less damaged, we would attempt to repair the original pieces, but this was so far gone that we determined that we would just reuse the mantlet casting and the casting for the ventilator and basically start over from scratch.
While the crew rebuilds their Panther, a mystery hangs over them. How did their Panther end up at the bottom of a river in Poland? The tank isn't talking, but it has left behind a kind of fingerprint. Stamped into the hull are serial numbers. They're still legible, which means German tank records might hold a clue. The military archives show Jacques' Panther was originally issued to the 16th Panzer Regiment in July 1944. 6 months later, the regiment was decimated on the Russian front. The records don't reveal how the Panther went down to defeat, but they do lead us to the Panther's original base in Bergen. Today, it's home to the ultra-modern Leopard 2. With its sloped front, advanced armor, and powerful gun, the Leopard is, in many ways, the modern descendant of the Panther. The Leopard's gun is made by the same company that built the Panther's gun. Firing 120mm rounds, the Leopard can knock out a target 2.5 miles away.
Ich glaube, dass der Kampfpanzer Leopard 2 zu Recht zu den besten Kampfpanzern der Welt gezählt wird, da vor allem der Mix zwischen Schutz, also der Panzerung, der Beweglichkeit, also der Mobilität insgesamt gesehen und der Feuerkraft einfach einzigartig ist.
The Leopard's gun is considered to be the best on the battlefield, and the American Army agrees. Former enemies now use the same German-made gun on their tanks. Modern tank crews take for granted that they can fire accurately on the move. The Panther could fire while in motion, but it probably wouldn't be able to hit its target. During the Second World War, American engineers tried to achieve gun stabilization with electric gyroscopes mounted in the turret. The German approach was completely different. They tried to stabilize the entire tank with a highly complex torsion bar suspension. This created 20 inches of suspension travel. In other words, a very smooth ride that was years ahead of its time.
I've seen film footage of Panthers in motion, both on the terrain and on a test track that has specific bumps. And you can see that the hull basically remains about level, and the suspension moves rapidly up and down, compensating for those bumps. The contemporaries, like a Sherman or a T-34, they have very limited suspension travel, and they are a very stiff, rough-riding vehicle. It's fairly fatiguing for the crew.
At Jacques' shop, it's time to start work on the Panther's 12-cylinder, 700-horsepower engine. Engines are Keith Bull's area of specialty.
Our Panther engine being sleeved, the cylinder walls are not cast into the block. They slip out. Okay. A sleeved engine is like a diesel engine. You take the sleeve out and you put a new sleeve in. Well, you can't buy a Maybach sleeve for a Panther engine, so we have to have it made.
Lightweight and powerful, Maybach engines were originally designed to power aircraft. This created serious problems for the Panther.
The engine and the engine block itself, it was really needlessly light and fragile versus what it could have been.
We have pictures of failures where they had connecting rod failures and they had head gasket problems because they had tried to keep the components, the weight of the components so light.
Early versions of the engine came with a serious design flaw.
The Panthers were always gasoline powered, and whenever you have gasoline, if the engine isn't tuned properly, if the ignition timing isn't right, it's possible to get what they call a stack fire or to spit through the carburetor. And the problem with gasoline is that it's also very explosive in confined areas, and that fire can very quickly move into the crew compartment.
The factory that built the Panther engine is gone, but the company remains. Today, MTU builds state-of-the-art engines for the German Army's Leopard 2 tanks. The Leopards thrive on MTU's 1,500 horsepower engines. Weighing over 61 tons, the Leopards can reach a road speed of 45 miles per hour. Unlike the Panther, they burn diesel, which gives greater mileage and is less combustible than gasoline. Michael Grodek is a senior technical director at MTU.
Our main challenges is always to get the most compact diesel engines which are achievable. If we make an engine or propulsion system much more compact, immediately the saved volume and weight will be used for additional equipment, maybe a bigger gun, maybe more fuel, maybe more ammunition, maybe a stronger armor protection to protect the tank against mines and things like this.
Unlike their modern counterparts, the Panthers burned gasoline, a highly flammable fuel and a deadly factor in a confined space. Could a fire have taken out Jacques Littlefield's Panther?
You know, originally we thought there had been a fire inside the vehicle, but on the Panther they use wooden blocks that are machined to hold the main gun rounds. And that wood was still intact. And also a large portion of the original wiring for the vehicle, the insulation was still intact, which would imply, because the wood was never burned and the wiring was still in place, that there had been an explosion, but actually no fire.
If the Panther didn't succumb to fire, what else could have destroyed such a powerful machine? Jacques Littlefield's crew in California is bringing a demolished Panther tank back to life. They've spent over 3 years on this project. Dave Marion has redesigned the shattered turret, which is being rebuilt off-site. When completed, the refurbished turret will fit into the turret ring.
Turned out pretty good.
That looks pretty centered? Yeah. Fortunately, we were able to find one in France that a collector had that was, I don't know if it was brand new, but it was in very good shape. And the one that, of course, that we'd had was both damaged and very badly rusted. And while you can always rebuild something like that, that would have been quite expensive to do.
With the turret ring in place, next up is the Panther's turret basket. Greg Taylor has been rebuilding the crew seats.
The German armored vehicles all had a standard seat frame. We have one good original seat that we've removed from the 222 armored car. We were able to copy that, and what I did is I made a fixture for the original seat that I could weld up, and we had a bunch of parts made of tubing that we could weld together to make replica seats.
Start.
Man, that is tight.
Yeah. Yeah, but it works. German precision.
Advanced armor, a powerful gun, and unmatched suspension all made the Panther a masterpiece of war. And that wasn't all. It had an extra gear mechanism, which enabled it to engage in neutral steer. This allowed the Panther's tracks to move in opposite directions at the same time.
The neutral steer on the Panther gives you more maneuverability at low speeds, so it can almost kind of pivot in position. And so all modern vehicles are like that now. The Panther, I guess, was one of the first vehicles to have the neutral steer capability. But you know, the US didn't have that until much later.
For modern tanks like the Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams, the Panther's neutral steer legacy is essential. In tank warfare, seconds with your back to the enemy could prove fatal.
Neutral steering means is that you have the ability to turn in place 360 degrees. And in tight spots, specifically in urban areas, where you don't have the ability to go around the corner, turn, and come back, or to do a U-turn, you know, the gun stays on the target while the tank is maneuvering out.
With the turret ring installed, the crew deals with the Panther's final drives. Final drives are gears that transfer power from the transmission to the drive sprockets. But on the Panther, these gears had a serious flaw.
If you look at the actual choice of gears they use basically straight spur gears. They use 3 gears involved, a double reduction system, and straight spur gears, and there's a lot of stress on just one gear tooth when you do that. If you compare that with, for instance, what was used on the Sherman tank, which used basically a set of double herringbone gears with more teeth and more surface area, really the Sherman gears were a better design and a better choice.
The flaw with the Panther's final drives was compounded by the fact that they were designed for a much lighter tank.
The final weight of a Panther is about 45 tons, and they were intended for a vehicle that weighed between 32 and 35 tons. The vehicle continued to get heavier and heavier and heavier as they added more armor, added more components that made it heavy. A common problem in military equipment is that you start out with a component like a final drive that was intended for one weight range, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and then the final drive is a weak point.
To avoid stripping the gears, Panther drivers were ordered to operate at reduced speeds. As a result, the Panther could never reach its full combat potential. And when the tank broke down on the battlefield, the crew was virtually paralyzed by the Panther's complex design.
On the Panther specifically, if you were to have, say, a transmission failure or a final drive failure, it would take days to get down to the final drives because everything, like the driver's seat, all the controls, all that stuff has to be removed before you can get actually to the final drive. The wheels on the Panther are interleaved, and so to get to one inner wheel, you have to take several of the outer wheels off in layers to get down to that one damaged wheel.
And then you had both sets of torsion bars to worry about. They did have access holes so you could get them from either side, but you often had to go to the other side of the tank to have access to push or pull a bar, which meant you had to take off the track and the wheels on the other side of the tank.
The German army fought the war relatively close to home ground. The Americans were fighting an ocean away. So American engineers came up with a time and life-saving concept: rapid field repair.
To remove the transmission on the Panther requires a big crane and disassembling quite a bit of stuff inside. To remove the transmission on a Sherman, for instance, the entire front end comes off so that the transmission and the final drives can come out really quite easily and be put back very easily. So that would really affect your ability to, if you had damage in the front end, to repair that tank in the field.
With lessons learned on the battlefield, rapid field repair is an integral component of modern tank design. Modern propulsion units like MTU's power pack for the German Leopard 2 tank are self-contained. These power packs house the engine, final drives, and transmission all in one unit. Changing engines is literally plug and play. Each day, the crew gets the Panther a little more functional. But they're still no closer to finding out what destroyed their tank over 60 years ago. They know some kind of explosion was involved. Was it sabotage? As the war progressed, German production relied more and more on forced labor. Millions of prisoners were forced to work in German factories. Some would protest through acts of sabotage. During their Panther restoration, Alan and Brian grapple with the final drives. But something doesn't make sense.
The bolts are loose. They've not been tightened up. All the bolts are loose on that cover. Whoever did it didn't do a very good job.
We found all sorts of things, from cigarette butts pushed into oil galleys, holes drilled into oil galleys to lose oil pressure, brake components manufactured in the wrong fashion so that they weren't as useful as they should have been. All manner of things just to slow the war machine up.
Were the final drives on Jacques' Panther damaged in an act of sabotage?
I've heard stories and even talked to people who had worked in these factories who talked about, knocking off a gear tooth and then kind of gluing it back on. But we haven't seen anything like that I can point to.
Sabotage is ruled out. But that just raises more questions. In the final months of the war on the bleak Russian front, something, somehow, took down this Panther. Valley, California. Jacques Littlefield's restoration crew is fitting their Panther tank with a new turret. Even without the gun, the massive turret still weighs over 15,000 pounds. There's no margin for error.
It all lifted
lifted up. There's very small clearances between the bottom of the turret and the top of the deck. As the turret turns, it can interfere with the driver's hatches or the engine hatches. And you're talking, you know, 1/3 of an inch in some cases. So you had to get everything right. And of course, if the turret doesn't turn exactly around, the basket that's hanging underneath it will be ob-round and it won't track properly either.
They've been waiting 3 months for this day. The fit has to be perfect.
Watch your head. Yeah. I'll get it center, front to back, and then I'll move it over to the left. No.
Boss is on the gearbox.
Okay, come down a little bit.
Probably gonna have to shift that way a little bit more. Just a tiny bit. There you go. You gotta kind of watch the back too, Keith.
Yeah. Come down a little bit slow. Yeah. Yeah. Come down slow. How's it look over there, Greg? Hold it. Hold it. Hold it. Come back up a little bit. Up. Up.
It's hitting on the back corner here, Keith.
Yeah, it needs to go forward.
Forward. Yeah.
Did that go down that time? How's it look over there?
I think you're down.
I think it's down. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Looks good from here. Okay. I'm turning. It turns.
After 3 long years, Jacques' crew has victory in its sights. Now, it's down to the final details.
After all, when you're working on things like seats and radios, it shows you've come a long way. You're not, you know, banging away on rusty iron, chunks of iron and rust, and we're past that point pretty much.
And as the Panther nears completion, the story of her death can finally be dredged up from the past. The Black Nita River flows past the Polish village of Bielecki Mills. Jacques' Panther spent over 40 years submerged beneath these waters. Henrik Grolitz was there that day in 1990 when the broken Panther was dragged out of the river. Edvard Tuchinski was a terrified 16-year-old witness the day the tank was destroyed. Both men can now open a window on the final moments of Jacques Littlefield's Panther. January 1945. In the dying months of the Second World War, the Soviet army was pounding the Germans into submission. The battle around the village of Bielecki Mills was ferocious and unforgiving.
Nazywam się Ciesiński Edward, mieszkam tu od urodzenia. Mieszkam od urodzenia. Tutaj u nas to był dzień, u nas to był świt, rozpoczęła się wojna. Porą, koń, krowy, wszystko nie dało, to nie dali uciekać, bo nie mamy. Nawet tu nie było czasu patrzeć na to. Był moment. Pociski grały, że trudno było wytrzymać.
Under fire from fighter bombers, the Panther tries to escape across the frozen river. many sections, the river runs 3 feet deep. But the crew makes a fatal mistake. They try to take their 45-ton tank across a section of the river that is much deeper than they realize.
Niestety nie udało się. Lód pod tą Panterą załamał się i osiadła na dnie. Dość mocno Niemcy mieli pecha. W tym miejscu rzeka ma prawie 3 metry głębokości i czołg osiadł.
Trapped and soon to be overwhelmed by the enemy, the Panther's crew followed standard military procedure.
The standard procedure with any army is that if you abandon a tank that's otherwise operational and the enemy might capture it, is there is a procedure for setting charges.
The source of the mysterious explosion that destroyed the turret is finally known.
There was a charge set in the turret because the turret was completely blown apart. I suspect from looking at the way the rust and the other damage patterns are that perhaps it sank down as far as the top of the hull, so that when the explosion went off, it blew the turret apart, but did not do lots of other damage, even to some of the thinner pieces of sheet metal inside.
Od dawna chodziły legendy o leżących czołgach w rzekach Kielecczyzny, czy też w bagnach Kielecczyzny. Miejsce, które jest za nami, również znane było z tego, że był tutaj zatopiony czołg niemiecki. Czołg ten został po ofensywie 1945 roku. Kilka z tych czołgów, które stały w Czarnej Nidzie, a tak się nazywa rzeka, która jest za nami, zostało przez polskie wojsko po wojnie zabranych stąd i rozebranych, pociętych na złom. Ten czołg został się, było za ciężko go wyciągnąć i dlatego został aż do lat 90.
The mystery of the Littlefield Panther has been solved, but completing this mechanical puzzle requires cooperation. Jacques Littlefield and Dave Marion have crossed the Atlantic to meet up with Kevin Wheatcroft and Alan and Brian Rudder. Both crews have spent years restoring their Panthers. And throughout the journey, they have helped each other get closer to fulfilling their dream.
Jacques Littlefield is obviously a renowned collector. He's a great guy to get along with. He's very helpful, he's very free with information. We've shared a lot of parts and a lot of knowledge between his mechanics and our mechanics.
It's really worked out very, very nicely. It saves us a lot of time and effort. And because his mechanics were the farthest ahead, they were the ones we would call when we had a problem. How did you take this apart? How did you take that apart? What did you do for this? And of course, they had all the answers.
With both teams helping each other, completion of the Panthers is within range. Jacques' crew is almost ready to celebrate.
When I get this engine put back together and we first fire it up and it runs great, it starts instantly, it's going to be a day to party.
Well, I'll tell you what, if there's any alcohol around, I'll probably have a drink that day.
Be pretty special, I think. Probably cry.
Anything else after this would be kind of like child's play, I think. You're taking a complicated vehicle anyway and trying to just make something out of nothing, basically.
The Panther. Born in Germany, destroyed in Poland, now reincarnated in California. For die-hard collectors in peacetime, a restored Panther is a dream come true. But once upon a war, coming face to face with this tank was a nightmare you'd never forget.